So I've been sitting here kind of thinking, how do I want to start this? And the truth was, I had no idea. So I just said, screw it, I'm going to hit the damn record button and we'll see how this goes. So if it fails or not, time will tell. But before I begin with what I'm going to say, I think I should introduce myself so I kind of let you guys know a little bit about me. I'm Airman First Class Adrian Cibalan in the United States Air Force, but everyone else just calls me CB. Just 2 letters, CB, quick and simple, because they can't say my last name. Currently 21, turned 21 a few weeks ago in November. I'm a crew chief, so I fix aircraft and fighter jets, and I've been stationed in Aviano, Italy for the past year and some change, I would say. So I've been able to travel around Europe, meet lots of great people. I've made some great friends while I'm in the military. My family's doing well, and I've had fun. I'm not gonna lie, I've been having some fun, just traveling around and just working and enjoying my youth. And on social media and on all that stuff, or on paper, my life, it probably seems I'm doing great. I'm having fun, traveling the world, just having a good time. But that's far from the truth. Because I've been struggling with depression for about 2 years now. And people look at me and talk to me and they get to know me and they don't think I have depression. And that's because I've been able to fake this personality where I'm very happy, very outgoing, always have a smile, always trying to crack jokes. And I've been doing that for the past 2 years. And I just got tired of being fake. And that's the bottom line. And I couldn't do it no more. And I finally reached out and asked my supervision, I need some help. And I won't lie, it was difficult. It took me 2 years to finally ask someone for help. And even asking for help, it took a while to get it out. And I was just scared, and I don't know how they were going to react, but luckily for me, they were very, very understanding. And they were getting me the help I need. And I'm not afraid to admit that I'm getting help. Being young, there's a lot, I don't know, especially in the military, there's a lot of stigma of people my age, my generation, we don't want to ask for help. You're kind of nervous, get a little scared. And I was like that. And it took me a while to finally have the courage to say, I need help. I'm not doing okay. I'm not happy. And I think that's something you need to realize, is you can't do this by yourself. And if you can, good on you, But if you can't, like me, I couldn't do this by myself. I tried to shoulder the weight for 2 years, and eventually it wore me down to the point where I was going to get in a worse depression and a darker mood, and I didn't want that. And I was tired of feeling down for myself. I was tired of saying, I don't want to go to the gym today because I'm sad, or I needed to get some help. And that's the bottom line, is if you feel this way as me, and someone who on paper has a great life, everything they need, and I can admit that I'm not happy with my life and I need help, maybe that can open up to you who's maybe in a different position, maybe a worse position, and say, this guy is in Italy and he's complaining and whining, when I'm not. I'm not happy, and I need to get help that I need. So that's really the bottom line, is I'm trying to point out, is just get some help, talk to someone. And there are people who generally will want to listen, and there are those who are not, and just avoid those people if you can, and just go. It doesn't matter. This doesn't matter whether you're in your active duty, guard, reserve, in whatever branch, or if you're law enforcement, first responder, or a civilian who just happened to watch this video. Your race, your ethnicity, your background, where you can, it doesn't care. It really doesn't care, and it gets a lot of people, and a lot of people don't get the help they need, and sometimes they reach such a dark hole and they turn to suicide, and they think that's the answer. And really, to you it might seem the answer, but you hurt a lot more people than you realize. You hurt your family, your co-workers, your friends, your loved ones. It affects a lot of people, and some people don't think about that, or they do, but they still go on with it. And why should you let others suffer for what you're suffering? So that's what I gotta say about that. But so, like I said, I don't care how old you are, what you do. If you are not happy and you feel depressed and you can admit that, and you can go get some help. Just talk to someone. That's all it really is just start by talking, and then you can get the steps you need to get to where you want to be.
Educating our communities on the threat of terrorism, you can help prevent potential terrorist attacks.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Blueprint Leadership Podcast. I'm Khalith Wright, your 18th Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force. During this time, you'll hear from some of my friends and my favorite leaders. We'll discuss all things leadership. Now, our goal is to provide insights, tips, and ultimately, we'd like to help current and future leaders find their path and reach their leadership goals. We call it Blueprint, but as we all know, there's no one way to lead. We want to share our experiences, give advice, and hopefully we can help you find your path and reach your potential as the great leader that you are.
I would submit to you that America is in love with its military. Our approval rating as an institution, as the profession of arms, has never been higher. But I would also submit to you that America is actually not in love with its senior officer corps. America is in love with its young enlisted, the greatest treasure in our nation's arsenal. And they expect you and I to take care of them as servant leaders.
And ladies and gentlemen, our next guest is not just my boss, my wingman, and one of my best friends, but an overall fabulous leader in our United States Air Force. He is the 21st Chief of Staff of the entire United States Air Force, General David Goldfein. Sir, welcome to the show.
Hey, Chief. Well, it's just an equal honor to be with the Chief Master Sergeant of the entire United States Air Force.
So is there any particular experience that was really formative for you as a leader?
You know, I've been blessed to have some incredible role models throughout my career. And I'm a believer that, you don't imitate, you emulate. You find the traits in the leaders that you admire and you try to emulate those. And it's equally important to take the examples of the leaders that you didn't particularly care for and learn those lessons as well. For me, I would say that some of the most formative experiences for me as a leader growing up through the ranks has been when I failed as a leader. And I believe that failure is actually part and parcel of any leadership experience. And if you're not failing, you ain't trying, because there's no way that we all get it exactly right. And for me, as I've gone back and sort of assessed, okay, what happened, what led to that bad decision, and what information was available that perhaps I didn't have or I didn't pick up on or didn't pay attention to, who was around that I could have talked to that could have helped me with that. For me, pretty common theme is that when my gut instincts have gone against the decision I've made because I thought somebody else had more information or was talked into something I knew in my gut was really the wrong way to go, it's been a bad decision every single time. So I've learned over the years to refine my gut instincts and that initial reaction you get. Malcolm Gladwell, wrote that book Blink, and one of the things he talks about in there is that initial. How do you refine that gut instinct reaction that you have, right, and learn to trust it over time? Because boy, when you go against your gut, danger, Will Robinson.
Yeah, I know. I happen to be a kind of a gut leader myself, and you're right. It is challenging sometimes to find the right balance between having all the right information and kind of going with your gut. You talked about failure. You've created a culture in our Air Force that said, hey, it's okay to fail, be innovative, take risk, and make decisions. You've pushed authority down to the lowest level at the squadron. Do you think our leaders across the Air Force have embraced this idea that it's okay to fail?
I'd start off by saying we have accomplished that together, and I think that's part of our brand a little bit, in terms of what we've tried to, because really one of the things that you and I have tried to focus on is trust. That we start the conversation based on the fact that we trust leaders in the Air Force to get after the business. And based on the fact that we trust them, we're very comfortable pushing decision authority, resources, exactly down where they're needed to do that. And hopefully, that trust goes two ways, right? That the force trusts us, to be taking the institution in the right direction. I think based on that foundation that we've set, we've been able to move the ball down the field in ways that you can't if you try to control things too much at the top. Think about it. How often have you and I said that, for many decisions that need to be made, we don't actually add value to the decision. We just add time, right? As people crawl through broken glass to finally get to us, to get a decision. And we ought to be only making decisions on things that only you and I can make. And everything else we got to push down. I'm a 3D guy, right? Do, delegate, and delete, right? Do what only you can do. Delegate everything else. And sometimes select all, delete is good for the soul.
Right. I've developed that same philosophy just watching you, and it's really been a mini MBA or mini PhD in leadership for me, being able to watch you at Corona and with your peers and the way that you lead. So that's been it's been really good watching it. And I think as I travel across the Air Force, we get pretty good feedback. I think people like what we're doing, and I'm not quite sure that everyone has embraced the it's okay to fail, but I think they trust us and they're trying to get after it. I've also watched you hire a lot of leaders, and I watched you manage the talent in the Air Force at the highest levels. What is it that you look for when you're hiring a leader? Like, what things are important to you from in terms of skills, abilities, characteristics?
Yeah, so the first thing I'm always looking for is character, and that's pass-fail. Because leadership is a gift, right? Like I said before, it's a gift that's given by those we're privileged to lead, and you have to re-earn that gift every day. And so as a servant leader, our airmen are wicked smart, and they will see through a say-do gap in us in a second, right? And so I'm first looking for individuals who live their life in a way that makes us all proud. And the other reason the character is so important is that American parents entrust their sons and daughters to us, and they expect us to take care of them. I often remind officer groups, especially as higher in ranks, I say, hey, let's just make sure that we're very clear on America right now has great trust and confidence in its military. But America is not in love, nor it should be, with its officer corps or its senior NCO corps. America expects us to take care of young airmen. That's who they're in love with, and that's who they should be in love with. So it starts and ends with me for character. And then after character, actually, I'm looking for growth. Is this an individual who actually has the potential to grow in the job? Or have they hit their glass ceiling? Are they an old dog that just can't learn too many new tricks? Have they sort of figured it all out? Because I don't know about you, but I ain't got it all figured out. I'm growing every day, in this job. And so once we stop growing, we stop learning. And once we stop learning, we stop listening. And, we always talk about together squinting with our ears out there. Part of that is making sure that we are listening to this force, paying attention to what matters to them, and not mirror imaging on what we think it's like for them, because that's what it was like for us. So for me, it's about character and growth.
And so sometimes, we get it wrong, though, right? So what advice would you have for, the leader who initially looks for character, they look for growth, they look for competence or whatever is important to them, only to discover at later on that, hey, I think I selected the wrong person? What does it take to be able to move forward?
People come to us with three attributes: skills, knowledge, and talent. Two of them are actually teachable. One of them is hardwiring. And so you can actually teach someone the right skills, and you can teach and give someone the right knowledge. You can't rewire their talent. And there's a couple of times where I failed terribly as a leader, because I thought by the power of my personality, and quite frankly, if I have to be honest, my ego, I thought, well, I can rewire this person for success. It never works, right? It's hardwiring, right? They're wired in a certain way. And what's tragic about that, when you keep somebody in the wrong position for too long, it's actually tragic for them, because deep down, they know it. They know that they're in a position that they're just not wired to succeed in. And so, for me, I try to first determine, okay, what's going on here? Is this a skills problem? Is this a knowledge problem? Or is this a talent problem? Or is this a hardwiring? And then if it's hardwiring, make the change. Don't delay. Because every day you delay, I had a subordinate commander once. I just didn't particularly like the way he commanded. And but he only had 6 months left, and I was new in command, and I took the easy route, which was I didn't dig into it. I didn't really go and look. And then it was after he left that everything came out, how toxic that environment was, how toxic it was for he and his spouse. They were both toxic as a command team. And for 6 months, that organization had to endure him. And guess whose fault that was? All mine. all mine, because I knew there was something there, and I chose the easy path and didn't dig into it. And it was talent. He was just wired absolutely wrong for what we were asking him to do. So that's what I would offer.
I would say that's a great lesson, because, I've watched you during our time together, both mentor other commanders about that same issue. Hey, don't just let someone hang around just because they have a little bit of time left. And I've also watched you ask senior leaders to step away. And so that's honestly a great lesson. This is a tough job. What's the toughest part for you?
I think, quite frankly, it's trying to achieve the right balance between the urgent and the important, because it's so easy to get captured by the urgent and forget what's important. And one of the ways that happens to us as senior leaders is we our schedule all of a sudden gets full, and you have 15 meetings, and then and they're in 15 to 20 minute duration, right? And you are hitting the tactical alligators that are just swamping the boat around you. And the real problem with that is that over time we actually become less effective in our roles, because your job, my job, together as a team, we got to be thinking about 5-10 years down the road. I'm the 21st chief, and I think one of my jobs is to build the Air Force that Chief 24 can win with. And Chief 24 just turned Brigadier General, right? And Chief 24, she's going to go to war in 2030 with the force that you and I build. And to put the kind of thought into building that kind of a force that can win against China or Russia or who knows in 2030 means we got to be looking down the road, and that's important. But to many, that's not urgent. Right. And so, how do you get that part right?
Yeah, I think, we both can probably attest to this. Helping with that is the staff that we have around us, and our staffs work pretty closely together, because I think from the outside, everybody's stuff is urgent to them. It may not be urgent, and sometimes may not even be important to us, but having a great staff, I think definitely helps.
Yeah, I think for both of us staffs, I always tell them, that's funny, in your and my world, it's always sunny. And there's always palm trees blowing, and things just show up, and there's a vehicle there, and there's an airplane there, and the reality is that only happens because we got folks around us who are taking care of so many details that we don't have to worry about, so we can focus on those big things.
Right. No, I can attest that. We both have great teams, and they really do take care of us. How do you maintain balance? We travel quite a bit. I might travel just a little bit more than you, but we also keep up pretty hectic schedules between being on the Hill, all the other things here in the D.C. area with industry, and obviously all the challenges in the Air Force. How do you and Miss Dawn maintain the right balance and keep yourself sane? How do you keep yourself sane?
So we have a little thing, so when I get home, God bless them, my team, sends me home with a bag of homework every night, and can we just say that it never gets looked at night, right? So when I get home, that's dawn time, So I get home, and we got these little, and you've been over to the Air House, just an incredible home that I'm privileged to live in, the Airman's home, and it looks out over the mall, and the Washington Monument, just this unbelievable view. And we have a little table and 2 chairs, and we just sit there at night and just talk, and unwind from the day and compare notes. And then we FaceTime, much to my daughter's chagrin. We FaceTime with the grandkids every night. Got to do it, right? And that's our time together. And then, then pick it up the next day, right? Then it's Air Force time. And so, if you try to look at balance in your life as a math equation, ain't gonna happen, right? You're gonna fail miserably and get very depressed, because there's no way you're gonna spend as much waking hours at home as you do at work, right? So it can never be a math equation. It's better to look at it, which is, when you're there, are you present, right? So when you're at work, are you present at work? And when you're at home, are you present at home? All right, and if you can do that, if you can disconnect, turn the phone off, and be present at home when you're at home, that's probably about the best you're going to do.
Yeah, I think I learned over the years to focus more on energy management than time management. There's sometimes I have the time to spend with Tanya or whomever, but if I don't have the right level of energy because I'm too tired, then you end up not being present. We've talked about this several times, and it's something that I think troubles both of us, but suicide in our Air Force. So, we've got some record number of airmen that have taken their own lives this year, and we asked a couple of months ago, we asked all of the wing commanders to do what we considered a resilience tactical pause, just have some dialogue about suicides. And our A1Z team and leaders across the Air Force have been trying to get after it. How are you feeling about this issue now? Where do you think we are? What do you think we should be doing different or better?
Well, I think like you, I feel terrible about our numbers this year. Right, we're having one of the worst years we've had in at least a decade, and so I read like you every loss of an airman, and it just crushes you after a while. So so what do you do about it? Right, what are we doing about it? Part of this is the way I think you and I have approached a lot of the challenges, and the opportunities we face as an Air Force, and that is, first of all, let's decide where we're going to have the most impact. And I don't believe there is any program that you and I can inflict on the force that will get after this. If there was, we would have already done it. And so the way to get after this, quite frankly, is at the unit level, and the lowest echelon of command team is they're going to have the most impact. And this is actually at flight level. That flight chief, flight commander are going to probably have, and the civilian equipment are really going to have the most impact, because that's that level of leadership and command where you really get to know your people. I mean, you know them personally by name, you know their families. The higher you go in the organization, the more more difficult that becomes, because just the size of the organization. So it's where those personal relationships occur in leadership. And again, if leadership truly is a gift that you got to re-earn every day, it means reaching out and connecting with our airmen, big A, active guard, reserve, and civilians. Then we're going to have the most impact. So I think our messaging has been effective in terms of trying to push, again, this authority down. And one of the things that you and I talked to the wing commanders about was, hey, don't make this a one and done. Don't check the square, right? Make this your own. That's why we didn't make it one full day stand down across the Air Force. I mean, that may have made us feel better, but it wouldn't have accomplished much, because commanders wouldn't have had a chance to actually make it truly their own and make it personal. So that's why we gave them that 45-day window. And oh, by the way, we're still in the window for the Guard and Reserve. Right, we specifically gave them a longer window because of drill weekends and the opportunity to actually get the force over a period of time. And so what I asked commanders to do was, hey, make it personal, and if you're comfortable, show a little bit of vulnerability. Sometimes airmen look at us and they think, my goodness, their lives are perfect. There's no challenges. And then that tends to become more of a burden on them, because it's okay, well, they're perfect. I mean, I think social media plays it in a way that can be negative. There's positive aspects, but there's a negative piece, which is that I forget what somebody told me. It was like the perfect Facebook, poor profile, right, where all the pictures are happy and everyone's out there looking great. And if you're suffering from depression, if you're working through some challenges and issues, and the world around you looks happy and perfect, it can actually feed into that depression. And so we're going to get after this, one leader and one airman at a time. This is going to be just a continual full contact sport.
I think one of the best things that has happened from us beginning this discussion is that more people are talking about it. More people are being vulnerable. More people are using social media. More people are actually revealing that, hey, that perfect Facebook page is actually not so perfect. Let me tell you how I'm really feeling. And the young man, Adrian, who emailed you and I asked him to, put a video together for us to kind of tell us how he was really feeling, and he talked about that exact same thing, that hey, I'm walking around and I'm smiling, but I'm hurting on the inside, and he thought it was important that his peers hear what he was really thinking. So I'm like I said, I'm hopeful that this will turn this around, but I'm thankful that more of our airmen are talking about it, and that it's a little bit of self-healing. So we've invested more resources in mental health and some of those other areas, but I also like to see that lots of airmen are taking care of each other in this arena. Lots more airmen are connected.
I was in a squadron commander's course, and one of the guest speakers was General Hal Hornberg, who at the time was commander of Air Combat Command. And somebody asked him in the class, they said, "Hey, sir, what's one of the most memorable moments you've had in all of your command tours?" And he didn't pause for a second. He said, "Well," he goes, "let me tell you a story." He goes, "I was actually a wing commander, and a senior NCO walked up to me and said, 'Hey, General Hornberg, you don't remember me, but I was actually in your group, and you had a commander's call, and you talked about suicide, and you had a specialist that was there with you that talked a little bit about it. What you don't know is I was in the stands. I had tried to complete that morning and failed, and I was in the stands contemplating how to complete the act that night. And you pointed out that specialist. I went and saw him, and I've been talking to him ever since. And you just need to know that you saved my life that day, and I just made senior master sergeant." Right. So he said, the lesson to you young commanders is don't ever underestimate the importance of you talking about this issue. Don't ever forget that it may get repetitive for you, but it's a new audience every time you speak. So get out there and talk about these tough issues, and I never forgot that story.
Let's transition a little bit. You wrote a book, Sharing Success and Owning Failure. Big hit. Lots of folks around the Air Force have, and I presume outside of the Air Force. Can you talk about just that concept? I mean, you wrote about a lot of good things from your time as a wing commander and your time as a squadron commander, but just this concept of we should share success with our teammates and own the failures. How did you come to that as the title?
Yeah, so I was interesting. So I just come out of squadron command in Italy, getting a chance to lead a squadron into combat, and was in senior professional military education with the State Department for a year. And one of the tasks that they gave us was to take an entire month and focus on just a writing project. And you could pick your topic, and you would write for a month. That's all you did for a month. And so what became that book is what I wrote. And my sole intent at the time was actually just having a paper that I could hand as a group commander, which was my next level of command I was told that I was going to at the time. I wanted to have something I could hand to my squadron commanders and say, "Hey, here's some things that I think. Here's how I think, and maybe it will help you in command." So this is really it was purely a mentoring paper that I put together. And the title really came from sort of what I'd learned at a squadron command, which is, you share every success, but when things go badly, that's why you get paid the big bucks, right? That's on the commander. And when you think about the loneliness of command that people talk about, for me, I actually never felt lonely in terms of who I was dealing with every day. I was never lonely. The loneliness of command is when the institution is failing, or you fail as a leader. And that's something that it's hard to share that. So the book was written in a conversational style with other inputs. And what I did was asked others to say, "Hey, we've all flunked in command. How about let's all share what we've learned so that readers can come up with their own failures, right? Not repeat ours." And so it's written in this conversational, Friday afternoon mentoring session style. And I think that resonated. So we're working right now on book 2. I'm honored, really honored that you've agreed to write the forward to it. And right now our title is Connect, Share, Learn: Thoughts on Leadership, and we're we're going to try to roll it out. Right now our initial target is February, March time frame, but for sure I want to roll it out before June. And it's going to be, sort of a continuation of the same style, right? But it picks up on what book 1 was all about, because I've gotten some interesting feedback over the years. Probably the most important feedback has been from spouses who have said, hey, where's my chapter? You talk about me as part of the command team, and you ask me to do things as part of this command team, but where's my chapter, where you're sharing with me. So Dawn and other spouses have actually contributed. So there's going to be a chapter, and threaded throughout the book is, okay, in this whole command team concept, what are some things we ought to share with spouses as they go forward? So I'm excited about it. We're working hard on it, and I'm hoping to get her out before June.
I'm looking forward to reading it. No pun intended, and looking forward to writing the foreword. So you better have your team pencil in some book signing time for your last few months in the seat, because I know people will be excited to hear it. Lots of tough challenges in the world. Russia, China, Space Force, lots of things happening in your world. What keeps you up at night, boss?
I always love, whenever I hear that question, I steal it, because I love the way Secretary Mattis answered it. Right? He said, what was it? He said, nothing keeps me up at night. I keep everybody else up at night. Right? I will tell you that I wouldn't say it keeps me up at night. I will tell you that I do think a lot about what I call a leader's mirror check. This is what you ought to be thinking about first thing in the morning when you look in the mirror, and last thing at night before we go to bed, right? And the question is every airman that we send into battle properly organized, trained, equipped, and well led, courageously led, so that they can get the nation's business done, and then when they return home to their families, we've taken care of them while they're gone. That to me is the essence of our moral obligation that we have in this gift called leadership. Right. And so what I wouldn't say I worry about it, but I focus on is that how do we ensure, how do you and I as the leaders of the institution, how do we ensure that we are preparing airmen to do the nation's business? And that's not necessarily always going forward. That's a big part of it. But we have folks right now that are standing the watch, guarding the nation in cyber. We have folks that are white now. I mean, we provide GPS for the world, and we have folks that are guarding the nation, standing the watch. We have folks right now that are 67 feet down in a missile launch facility in the northern tier, right? That have their hands on the most destructive weaponry on the planet. So when you take a look at all the things that we do as an Air Force, I think that's what I think is our obligation as leaders, to make sure those airmen are prepared every day.
And of all of those, being organized, being properly trained, being properly equipped, and being courageously led, I think the courageously led part, I've heard you talk about, that's our most important contribution, is ensuring that we have the right leaders in the right place. And I think both of us have focused during our tenure on building the right leaders, and I think so. Chief 24 will be in good hands. I think we'll transition. We had a few internet questions that we want to have you answer, so I'm going to turn it over to Senior Master Sergeant Harry Bubba Kibbe.
All right, thank you very much, Chief. General, question number 1 comes from Facebook. Danielle would like to know, what does it mean to be vulnerable as a leader, and do you have any recent examples?
I think more than anything, that vulnerability is to show a little bit of who you are. Airmen want to know that we're real people, right? That we have aspirations, that we have limitations, that we have challenges, that that our world is not, nobody's world is perfect. And so I think that vulnerability is to share a bit of yourself when you're out and about. And, I saw a great example of that very recently. I had an opportunity to travel through the AOR and Middle East with our new Secretary of the Air Force, Secretary Barrett. And somebody asked her in an all call, about this same issue of vulnerability. And she didn't hesitate for a second. She says, well, I lost my dad when I was 13 years old, and I was the oldest of 6 siblings on a ranch. We were a poor family, and I immediately had to take over the responsibility of one of the breadwinner in the family and taking care of my siblings. And this is a person who went on to be a CEO, a incredibly successful, not only entrepreneur, business leader, ambassador to Finland. I mean, her resume is unbelievable, right? But in that moment on stage with those airmen, she opened herself, shared some vulnerability about her personal past. And I think that, if you believe like I do that there's not a single all call we could go back to right now and ask, if you ask everybody, hey, what'd the chief say? For both of us, right? They say, I don't know. He was up there on stage and, he talked a lot, right? But then if you asked him, okay, how'd they make you feel? Most of them will be able to tell you, yeah, they made us feel valued, respected, And in that moment, our secretary, I think, really made that airman who asked and everybody in that all call feel like we're human and we're vulnerable.
Thank you, General. That's a great example. I thought you might talk about seeing Chief Wright be vulnerable when he was singing with the Air Force Band.
Oh yeah. I still got that. I got that on my cell phone.
Oh man.
General Leslie from Twitter would like to know, what do you tell aspiring leaders who want to know how they can follow in your footsteps?
Yeah. So first, I will tell you that there's no one path to the top, and it's a journey, not a destination. If you get focused on the destination, then you end up, adding way too much stress in your life, and you miss a lot of great opportunities for growth along the way. So, I get how many times I've talked to a young airman, brand new, and they'll say, "Sir, what do you?" I'll tell you about this one great lunch I was having at Lackland, and they had taken some young, not even graduated folks in BMT to have lunch with the chief. And I got this young, cadet, right, who asked me, hey, sir, she asked me, she goes, I don't know how I get some of those. She pointed to my stars, right? And I said, well, having lunch with the chief, that's not a bad start. I said, but let me be honest with you. I said, there's only one way, and that is be the very best at what you're doing right now. Be the very best, young airman in this course. And then when you go to your tech school, be the very best to graduate from tech school. And when you end up at your first location, you work hard to be the very best at whatever it is that we've asked you to do. Because by being the best, you will make the impression that sets you up for whatever it is that you want to do. And so if we focus our airmen on that journey, it's an incredible opportunity. And there's so many things that you can do along the way that are not only fun, but that will allow you to grow. If you focus too much on the destination, I fear that we may miss out.
Would you have ever asked the chief of staff that question when you were a young cadet?
I think when I was a young cadet, I couldn't pick the chief of staff of the Air Force out of a lineup, But I will tell you, I think I've used the story on the road, and it's just, I love it, right? So we were in Bagram together, the chief and I, right? And this young airman, pretty young, probably for sure on a first deployment, is looking at his chief master sergeant of the Air Force, right? And, got a lot of folks around him, and he came up to me and he pulled on my arm and he goes, hey, dude, he said, take a picture of me and the chief. So of course my answer was absolutely, right? So I grabbed his cell phone, and he's still, I walked up to the chief and I said, hey, chief, take a picture of this young airman, would you? And so, you got that big, put your arm around this airman, right? And I told that airman, I said, okay, focus right here, on the stars. And he's like, oh my God, it's perfect.
We had a similar experience a couple weeks ago, if you don't mind me telling you.
Yeah.
Herschel Walker was at Andrews. We were doing a conference there. And Herschel Walker, whenever he is in the room, he's the one everyone wants to take pictures with. One of the greatest football players of all time. Airmen, after Chief and Mr. Walker were done talking, airmen were lined up to get their picture taken, and Herschel was ready to take pictures with them, and some people handed him the camera, and he's like, and for a brief second, he handled it really well. But, for a brief moment there, he ended up taking pictures of several airmen with Chief.
Yeah. That says a lot. Our airmen love their chief.
All right, we have one final question, sir.
just came in on Reddit, and the question is, how important is feedback to leaders, and how can you help leaders receive feedback?
I'd say it's both incredibly important and hard to do well. And it actually becomes harder the older the individual gets that you're giving feedback to. It's actually, young airmen, it's sort of a natural, almost a paternal instinct or a maternal instinct that kicks in that says, okay, I want to spend time mentoring this young person, right? It's actually harder sometimes to mentor a more senior officer or NCO but actually, if they're in the growth industry, back to the original discussion we had about what I look for in a leader, if they're in the growth industry, they actually require mentoring. And the higher we go as we get this rank, right, the more people tell us what they think we want to hear, as opposed to give us real feedback. So not only is it incredibly important to do, but I would also offer to those out there, those especially in wing command, right? Let's do a mirror check here. How often have you been spending with your chiefs and your group commanders, giving them meaningful feedback? Because they need it actually as much as the young airmen that you're spending time with. And that goes for us all the way up the chain.
Thank you, General Goldfein. As always, for the listeners out there, also thank you. And if you'd like to reach General Goldfein, he's on Facebook and Twitter. And back to you, Chief.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. So we're running out of time here, boss. But the history books will show that you revitalized squadrons. You really got us thinking about developing joint leaders and teams, advancing multi-domain command and control. You brought in AFWIC, Air Force Warfighting Integration Center. You've revamped the officer evaluation system. You've done a lot of great things for our airmen and Air Force. What do you want your legacy to be? What do you want people to remember you for?
Yeah. So first, I'll push back a little bit, and with because I've learned over the years, right, when I've been mentored by chiefs, right, which has been some of the best mentoring I've ever gotten. They always start with all due respect, right? Then something good's coming, right? So I'll just start off by saying everywhere you just said we got to turn into we, right? Beginning with you and me as a team, and then also the broader team in terms of what we as a team have been able to move forward. And then when it comes to legacy, I actually think there's only one legacy that matters, that's lasting, and that's those we've invested in to replace us. And have we, because we're all in the launch business, and the question is, who have we launched? And have we launched those who perhaps don't look or sound like us? And do we understand that the value of diversity as a warfighting imperative? And that, just like the analogy of the launch business, we also have a red guarded switch to destruct if that individual we are launching starts going off course and looks like it's going to damage a population, right? We have a way of destructing that. So to me, that's the most important thing that you ever leave behind, right? Is that who did you and I see potential in that they didn't see in themselves, and then we perhaps opened a door here, we presented an opportunity there, but we didn't walk in ahead of them and then pull them through. We actually walked them up to the door and then stood back, and then they walked through, and then as we look back, years from now, you and I, sitting around a fire pit with a cigar and a adult beverage, and I'm hoping, and Don and Tanya, and we're just sort of looking back. What I think we'll be most proud of is looking at the leadership team of the United States Air Force, and Chief 24 and Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force 35, and looking at, okay, that individual was, one of the ones, that we saw some potential in, and we opened a door. That, I think, is the only legacy we leave behind that actually lasts.
Yeah, I think, people will they'll remember you as a great general and a pretty cool dude. So, so our time as the chief and chief team in this Air Force is almost up. We're both, I think, inside of a year. What are you planning to do next?
So first of all, I'd say we're not quite dead yet. Right? We gotta run through the tape together. We got a lot of things to do, boy. We got a Space Force we got to build. Boy, that's exciting. Talk about being part of history. I mean, we're present at the creation of something new and exciting. And I think part of what you and I got to do is make sure we build this foundation on trust and confidence, right? Because this is a marriage, not a divorce, right? This is something powerful and very positive. And we got to build it in a way that's, built on trust and confidence and a foundation of trust. But at the same time, we got to give this new service room to develop its own unique service culture that's oriented towards space and warfighting. And so that, I think, is a big part of what, we got left on our plates. I think that we got to cement in the work we've done on joint leader development and joint warfighting as we really shift to that Air Force we need to be able to fight and win in that 2030 and beyond time frame. And so there's a lot of work to be done. And then what comes next? I'll tell you that here's as much thought as I put into it. My focus is going to be, number one, to be a really good husband that I have, in a way that I haven't been able to be, right, because of the time constraints. A really good son. I'm going to go move back to where my mom lives and my in-laws live. A really good father, because we'll be in the same state as our daughters, our son-in-laws, and a really great world-class grandpa or pawpaw to our granddaughters. So that's job one. And I will tell you that Dawn has been with me on this journey. We were high school sweethearts. We met over 4 decades ago. We've been in this Air Force will be 37 years, and it's now about her. And so we're going to go live exactly where she wants to live, in a house that she wants to live in. And I've told her I have very few requirements from here on out. So I look forward to the next chapter. It's still so far out for me that we got miles to go. Yes, sir. Between now and June, and for sure can't let up on the gas.
Well, I'll keep my eyes on that plot of land next to yours in San Antonio. So, yeah. Okay. Any final thoughts for our listeners, boss?
No, actually, I would just say this: that of all of the leadership, of all of the personnel decisions I made as chief, the most important one I made was selecting you as Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force. And when you get that right, between an officer and a NCO, a general and a chief, man, it's magic and it's poetry, And this has been perhaps one of the funnest part of the journey is being able to do this with you and with Tanya. And I just feel blessed every day that we get a chance to work together.
Yes, sir. Thank you. We definitely appreciate the support and the friendship. We've had a lot of great times, a lot of great laughs. So thank you. Well, thanks again, sir, for being a great guest and taking the time out to talk about some important leadership topics. I'm sure our airmen really appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun, but I know you have some things to get back to, and so do I. Let me just take a minute to thank the SAF PA team. Harry and Tony and Sergeant Shinzato and Sergeant Walters, Joe, and everybody that helped out with the podcast. And lastly, let me thank all of our current and future leaders out there who are trying to become the best leaders that they can be. If you want to find out more about what we're doing in the Office of the Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, check out Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. This has been your Blueprint Leadership Podcast. I'm Chief Master Sergeant K. Wright. Thanks for listening, and always remember, if better is possible, good is never enough, and you are your greatest competition.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Melania. And hello, Joint Base Andrews, special place. At ease. We have good news for you. On behalf of the First Lady, Vice President Mike Pence, Mrs. Pence, I want to wish everybody a very Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. This is a truly historic day for the American Armed Forces. In just a few minutes, I will proudly sign into law the largest ever investment in the United States military. In fact, I can say the largest ever by far. Today also marks another landmark achievement as we officially inaugurate the newest branch of our military. This is a very big and important moment. It's called the Space Force. Most importantly, we are supporting you, the heroes who defend our families, secure our nation, and protect our freedom. The 2020 National Defense Authorization Act is about making sure our warfighting field, I use it often. There is no greater honor than to serve as your Commander-in-Chief. I especially want to thank the incredible people who fly and maintain Air Force One. You are the best of the best. Thank you very much for doing such an incredible job. Today's signing of the 2020 NDAA is a watershed event in the truest sense of the word. Before I came into office, the military endured deep and devastating budget cuts. Our military, quite frankly, was very depleted. As a candidate for president, I promised to reverse these crippling cuts and to ensure our military remains unchallenged and unrivaled anywhere in the world. And right now, there is no one, there is no country that comes even close. The law I'm signing today provides $738 billion. That's with a B. $738 billion in defense funding for the 2020. That's an all-time record in the history of our country. That's the highest amount we've ever spent on our military. And that's after $700 billion in my first year and $716 billion last year. And it's all made right here in the USA. It's very important. And I have to say that we make the finest equipment, the finest planes, the finest missiles, the finest ships. We make the finest equipment anywhere in the world. It's not even close. This brings our total investment in national defense since my inauguration to almost $2.5 trillion. Then what's the good of a budget if you don't have the best military in the world? And now we focus on the budget a little bit. Is that okay? We'll focus on the budget. $2.5 trillion, so that's really something. And it's new and it's beautiful, and within the next 12 months, you'll have most of it. In addition to massive acquisitions in the past 2 years, this bill authorizes nearly 100 new F-35s, 24 brand new FA-18s, 155 Army helicopters of all different types, 165 brand new beautiful Abrams tanks, said to be the best in the world, more than 50 Paladin howitzers, 2 new Virginia-class submarines, 3 new Arleigh Burke destroyers, a Ford-class aircraft carrier, and 2 others on their way, and much, much more. But as we discussed earlier, our military is getting far more than just new equipment. For this first time, and I have to say, you know what happened last year? It was a good pay raise, but now you're getting another pay raise, and this will be the largest pay raise in more than 10 years, more than a decade. So if you don't want it, you don't have to take it. For the first time since President Harry Truman created the Air Force over 70 years ago, think of that, we will create a brand new American military service. That's such a momentous statement. 70 years ago, the Air Force. With my signature today, you will witness the birth of the Space Force, and that will be now officially the 6th branch of the United States Armed Forces. That is something really incredible. It's a big moment. That's a big moment, and we're all here for it. Space. Going to be a lot of things happening in space, because space is the world's newest warfighting domain. Amid grave threats to our national security, American superiority in space is absolutely vital. And we're leading, but we're not leading by enough, but very shortly we'll be leading by a lot. The Space Force will help us deter aggression and control the ultimate high ground. I particularly want to thank Vice President Mike Pence. He was so involved in this with me. This was a real, the spirit, the love that I think we can say, Mike, that we both had for this project, because we realized how important it is to our military, to our future, to our defense. So important. And it's going to blend in magnificently with everything else that we have. So I want to thank Mike Pence. Mike, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Great job, Mike. It was nearly half a century from Kitty Hawk to the creation of the Air Force, and now it's 50 years after Apollo 11 that we create the Space Force. With today's signing, I will proudly appoint General J. Raymond, the first Chief of Space Operations, and he will become the very first member of the Space Force, and he will be on the Joint Chiefs. He will be on the Joint Chiefs, which are now expanding by one position. That's a very powerful position. So, General Raymond, congratulations, and thank you for everything you've done. The 2020 NDA also protects the vital legal tools we need to defend America's borders. The law improves education, child care, and private housing for military families, and it ends the so-called widow's tax, which blocked benefits for families of fallen heroes. The tax is gone. It was very important. That was very important to us. Widow's tax is gone. After years of unrealized promises by other politicians, I honor my commitment today as I sign paid parental leave for the federal civilian workforce. That's paid into law. So thank you very much. That's a very big thing, paid parental leave, another thing that they've been trying to get for many years. As we head into Christmas, I am proud to report that we're giving every soldier, sailor, airman, Coast Guardsman, and Marine a well-earned pay raise. In January, each of you will see the largest increase that you have had in such a long time. In fact, it goes back so far that a lot of people don't even know what that date is. I can just tell you it's a lot of money. And I say it, and I say it again. If you'd like not to take it, if you'd like to make a donation to your great country, please just let us know. We'll give you a little bit less. Any takers, by the way? I don't know. Now, congratulations on that. With this legislation, we show our undying commitment to the warriors who keep us safe. These are incredible warriors. These are brave, powerful warriors, and now they have the best equipment anywhere in the world, and it's not even close. Just weeks ago, U.S. Special Forces brought the world's most wanted terrorist to justice. The monstrous animal known as al-Baghdadi, the founder and leader of ISIS, is dead, and his second was just given the post of being in charge, and he is also dead. Within 3 years of record military investment, our country has rejected a future of American decline and embraced our destiny of American dominance. Our military is now dominant, far ahead of any of our competitors. And if you saw where we started from not so long ago, you'd really be amazed. I want to thank everybody, but I want to also thank those great companies that really designed, made this equipment, because I have seen it, and I've seen much of it in action, and I've frankly never seen anything like it in my life. So I just want to congratulate you all, because together we are protecting our people, our values, our traditions, and our glorious American flag. Yeah. I want to just end by wishing our armed forces, our great people, a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. God bless you, God bless our military, and God bless America. God bless America. So it's now my honor to sign the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act into law. And again, congratulations. Thank you all very much. Very, very special people. Thank you very much.
When the president stated openly that space is a warfighting domain and we have to dominate that domain just like we do in every other domain, it opened the aperture for us to talk about what we as a service have been passionate about for years. And we have 3 tasks ahead of us. We got to defend what we have, because it's going to be there for a while and we all depend on it. And while we're defending what we have, we got to transition to a defendable architecture. And we are moving out to do that. At the same time, we have to build this force. And the reason I'm excited about the Space Force as a service within our Department of the Air Force is because we're being given the opportunity to build something really positive. And we have got to find the sweet spot, you and I, because most of the Space Force will come out of our service with our joint teammates. Here's the sweet spot we got to find. We got to build this service on a foundation of trust and confidence, while at the same time allowing enough room for this service to develop its own unique culture.
Good afternoon. I'm Louisa Savage. I'm an executive director with Politico, and we are very pleased to be here in our 2nd year of a media partnership with the Halifax Security Forum, particularly as we grow Politico into a global policy and politics news organization, and especially since this year we are building out Politico Canada on top of Politico and Politico Europe. So it's a special day for us, and thank you to Peter and the forum for having us here. Our panel is called The Arctic, End of the Earth, which I guess makes sense if you think there's an end on a sphere. But I think we would all agree that the Arctic is really more the center stage right now for some of the key trends that are shaping the world, and those include climate change, of course, and the rise of great power competition, the rise of China and its ambitions. So those are the topics that I'm hoping we will dive into today and see how democracies are or aren't positioning themselves to this changing situation. And we know the Arctic is also obviously a big strategic and military importance due to its location going back to the Cold War. So with us, we have a great panel that will represent various stakeholders in the Arctic. We have, of course, Secretary of the Navy, Richard Spencer. Thank you for being with us. We have General Terrence O'Shaughnessy, who is both commander of NORAD and of U.S. Northern Command, and that is particularly significant because he is charged with being the advocate for the Arctic within the entire U.S. military and articulating the capabilities that the Arctic requires. And we also have Major General Tammy Harris, who's a former deputy commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force. And we have Mr. Espen Barth Eide, who is a member of the Norwegian Parliament and a former defense minister and also former foreign minister. So thank you for being with us. And I'd like to start our conversation talking about the big picture on the Arctic. But before I do, I just wanted to give the Secretary the opportunity to respond to the breaking news that a lot of people in this room are buzzing about right now, and that is the New York Times story that just broke. Can you confirm, or do you want to comment on this story that you were threatening to resign from your post if the Navy is not allowed to sort out its own process around the Navy SEAL who the President would like to promote?
The Arctic is a very important place. Contrary to popular belief, I'm still here. I did not threaten to resign. But let us just say that we're here to talk about external threats, and Eddie Gallagher is not one of them.
All right, is everyone satisfied with that answer? I'm just here as your proxy. All right. Well, so back to the Arctic. So the backdrop is such that China has said it wants to build the Polar Silk Road over the Arctic to cut weeks off of shipping times to the Western Hemisphere. Russia has articulated an Arctic strategy, which has been described to me by Sherry Goodman, a former U.S. Deputy Defense Secretary, as an attempt to build a Russian toll road that requires Russian icebreakers to escort ships that will want to use those seaways. And it has been investing in icebreakers and nuclear icebreakers. President Putin has talked about it in terms of competitiveness and also prestige. So I wanted to ask you, Secretary, first, how do you see America's evolving strategy, the big picture on the Arctic?
It was very interesting. My first international trip after being sworn in was to Reykjavik to the Arctic convivium that we had up there, the council. And to be very frank with you, I was not that knowledgeable on what was going on in the Arctic. I'd had the superficial briefs, and having spent 2 days up there at the conference, my eyes were peeled back as to what was really going on up there. We heard about the activities then of Russia putting 10,000 Spetsnaz troops up there, repaving 6 Cold War airstrips, all for, as the ambassador from Russia said, search and rescue. It was a great concern to me. We went back and we dusted off what was then called the Navy's roadmap to the Arctic and really focused it to be a strategy that, or a sub-strategy that undergirded the national defense strategy. It is one of our key focus areas. I mean, General O'Shaughnessy has this square in his lap, but Navy is there as one of the supporting teams for the U.S. approach to how we keep order, peace, and resiliency up there going forward.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the place that the Arctic occupies in U.S. strategic planning right now, is it rising up the ranks? Is it becoming a more important issue as the waters melt and as these countries take more aggressive steps in the Arctic?
I would certainly say it is, and part of the reason is, I think, as we look at all the activity we see in the Arctic, and some of that was mentioned in the Secretary's speech, and earlier today we talked about the rules-based international order all over the globe and how important that is, equally as important within the Arctic. But from our perspective as well is the defense of our nations, and I represent both NORAD and NORTHCOM. On the NORAD side, the defense of both the U.S. and Canada, and then on the NORTHCOM side, the defense of the United States. We find that this is actually key terrain. And this is really almost going back in time. And we've, over the last several decades, maybe spent less interest from the military standpoint in the Arctic. But now as we see Russia activities, we see Chinese activities, and we see potential threats coming through the Arctic, this becomes increasingly more important to us within both the NORAD side and the NORTHCOM side. And so we do see an increasing emphasis on it, increasing priority on it, and of course with Homeland Defense, Continental Defense being our top priority, the Arctic has become front and center to some of our conversations.
Mm-hmm. And I want to talk about the specific threats in a few minutes, but just staying on this broader vision, if Russia's looking at this and saying there's a lot of money to be made in the Arctic, there's oil and gas, there's drilling, and China's saying fish stocks are moving north and we want access to that protein, is the U.S. looking at the Arctic merely as a theater for defensive operations, or do we have other strategic and economic interests in there? How do you see it in the broad sense?
If the specific question to the U.S. side is we have our own resources up there as well, and so it becomes important for us as a nation to make sure we secure them, make sure we maintain access to them. And then from the global perspective, again, it's the rules-based international order that has served so well across the globe, applies equally as well to the Arctic. And so whether we talk about some of the things the Russians are doing and they're demanding that aren't necessarily in accordance with the normal rules that we would expect to see, we see China and other places doing coercive economics, other things. We want to make sure that doesn't apply in the Arctic. So we look at it both from the U.S. perspective of our own natural resource up there and make sure we protect them, but also from the global perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. And Major General Harris, from the Canadian perspective, there are Canadians who see the Arctic as not their backyard, but their front yard. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about today, what is Canada's strategy and policy around the Arctic?
Sure. For those who don't know, actually, the Arctic is 40% of our landmass, 75% of our coastline, so we have 200,000 inhabitants up there. A rich indigenous culture that we want to preserve, and a lot of ecosystems. So it's very near and dear to our heart, and we partner with our U.S. colleagues on ensuring that we maintain safety for North America and the approaches. So recently, in 2019 of September, this current government released its Arctic and Northern Framework. The jury's out on a lot of people have an opinion on what it is or it isn't. I see it as a strategic visionary document that will enable future Arctic policy development and investment to be nested under that. In 2017, our Minister Sajjan released and pinned with many people in this room, including General Vance, the Canadian Defence Policy, Strong, Secure, and Engage, and it highlighted a lot of Arctic aspirations of things that we want to do and continue to do with our partners and allies. So it maintains, it has been, it is, and it will always be a key priority, I think, for all Canadians.
Well, I think the discussion paper that we read that was submitted as part of this conference by Tom Axworthy suggested that the Canadian policy is really, I can't remember the word he used, but it was, he didn't take it very seriously. And you're talking about it as a visionary document. Can you explain what is visionary about it? How do you?
I say visionary in that the sense it's a chapeau document, in my opinion, and hopefully more solid, more detailed, articulate policy will fall out of that, and it will nest under that. They just appointed a new Minister of Northern Affairs who has just a portfolio for the North. I mean, the reality is, and you had mentioned it, and I think my colleagues would agree on the panel, that the Arctic is a harsh environment. It requires specialized training and certain gear. It's a vast and unforgiving geography. It has limited infrastructure. It has limited and unreliable communications, and it costs a lot of money to work there. So there can be a lot of aspirations, and as hard as you work at changing those into concrete actions, it just doesn't always happen. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of men and women certainly in uniform, and I can speak to that because that's more of my area of expertise, working really hard to ensure we have a presence in the Arctic, and we're doing the right things with our partners and allies.
I was struck by looking at the policy. It talked a lot about a vision for bringing services to the people who live in the Arctic. It talked about education, research, and it also stated an aim to, quote, restore Canada as an Arctic leader. Would you say Canada is an Arctic leader today?
No. I think we're one of the more of the eight. I'd say we're probably in my opinion, can't speak on behalf of the government, but I think we're one of the least developed in the region.
And what would it mean, what would it look like for Canada to be an Arctic leader?
In my opinion, you have to have a constant presence, and that requires infrastructure, that requires having people there, and it requires having different services, and just the basics of what they're talking about for the people who live there. So it's a huge investment, and with investment is competing priorities of how you're going to do that. So I think it's a more concentrated presence in the region.
And Mr. Eide, from the Norwegian perspective, how do you see the big picture on the Arctic?
So I was here at the very first Halifax Security Forum talking about the Arctic, so there's a certain déjà vu. Back then, we, Norway, and the government of Jens Stoltenberg that I served in as a minister, we were trying to raise the attention of our allies that something important was going on. And the argument is and was that the Arctic is an ocean. It's the opposite of Antarctica, not only because it's on the opposite side, but also because Antarctica is a landmass with ice on it, and the Arctic is an ocean with countries around it. And it used to be frozen. And hence its military meaning was first and foremost that it was the shortest flying route for planes and missiles over between Soviet Union and the US, and you can hide your submarines there. But otherwise there wasn't much attention, apart from that in the very sort of high strategic picture. Now the ice is melting, which is bad news. It's because of climate change. But the consequence of the melting ice is that it becomes more like a normal ocean, and it's an ocean that connects, again, Russia to North America and Europe to Asia, because this will be a future sailing and transport route, and there's also a lot of commercial interest in exploring and exploiting the resources of the region. So what we were arguing then is that our allies need to take some interest in this development. We did not want to sound an alarm bell saying that a war is about to break out, but important things are happening. So the good news is there's more of that attention now. We were at the same time arguing that NATO had developed into an organization that were basically only doing out-of-area operations and non-Article 5. And that's fine, but we also should do a little bit of area and Article 5, and that also has clearly changed. And I was very happy to see Trident Juncture, this largest exercise for decades happening in my home country, Norway. I think that's the direct consequence of that change in NATO. What I also want to say is that the good news is that this is not the South China Sea. There is actually no significant dispute over the legal order, because every single state has either signed UNCLOS, the Law of the Seas Convention, or they haven't signed as the United States, but they have declared that they will abide by all its obligations. I mean, it beats me why they're smart, but that's up to the Americans to decide, but still they behave as if. And that means, and this has been confirmed in all Arctic encounters, that we base the cooperation on an existing legal framework, which means that that's something we should take care of. We should maintain that. There's a mutual interest. No country has more interest in this being true than Russia, because half of the Arctic coast is Russian. They will also be worried if everybody else came in and exploited their resources, so we actually happen to have a shared interest with them. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to what's going on. We should follow, we should be present, we should have capabilities of being present with ice breakers and ice-prepared vessels and with relevant communications equipment. So this is important, but it's not alarming, is my message. And I think that we should continue to think along those lines, and we can strengthen NATO's recognition that this is area. It's not like we are going to the Arctic, we are there, we live there. I mean, the Canadians live there, Alaskans live there, then Danes and Greenlanders live there, we Norwegians live there. It's our area, so it's part of NATO's area, and it always was.
So you said important but not alarming, so I'm going to ask the Secretary to alarm us. What have you seen, either in maritime activity or other activity? You talked about a gray zone of aggression. What are you seeing on the ground that concerns you in terms of threats?
Well, right off the bat, what I first referred to was that while our Russian counterparts are up there lighting up some old, Cold War facilities, more than I would have thought you needed for search and rescue. The Chinese are up there researching and call themselves a near Arctic participant. I totally agree with Norway in that it's not to the level of alarm per se, but we need to be up there and present to make sure that we're attentive to what's going on, because things could change dramatically in a fairly short period of time.
Well, what do you think China's up to? How do you understand?
Well, I think they're up there probably looking for resources, just like everybody else. The question is, I don't know what they're going to play for a card as far as the ability to participate, but this is why we have to be up there to know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. General O'Shaughnessy, what do you see as the biggest threat there that concerns you right now?
Well, as the Secretary mentioned, we do see a buildup of Russia and Russian capability. And
what are they building up?
All the way from the infrastructure that the Secretary mentioned and the bases, but also, and perhaps more disturbingly, if you look at that, it might make sense. They have a large percent of their GDP, 20+%, coming from the Arctic, and as such, it would make sense. that they would have some capability there. But what we see is investment in their long-range aviation. We see investment in cruise missiles that far exceed the range that they would necessarily need in a regional conflict. And so we see some potential there that they're trying to use this as an avenue of approach towards North America. So with both my hats of a NORAD commander and a NORTHCOM commander, that causes us concern. And so we want to make sure we have the ability to operate in that environment as well. We need to be able to defend ourselves from that avenue of approach. And whilst we're certainly not trying to militarize it per se, we still have to have the ability to defend our nations.
And this reminds me, growing up in Alberta, of being told that Canada was the bologna and the nuclear sandwich between America and the Soviet Union. What are the threats here for Canada that you see evolving, if any?
Well, they're the exact same threats as the U.S. have mentioned, the Secretary and the Commander. I think there's other threats that are evolving that are maybe less hostile in the sense that as the climate changes, there's more shipping, there's more commercial cargo, there's more tourism, there's more research vessels, as the Secretary said, which then requires a more rapid response for search and rescue. And that becomes a threat for us if we're not able to do it in a fast enough time. And I think that's something that's, as more and more people are going into the Arctic and more things are happening, we have to be able to respond to the needs of people. And I can speak firsthand, as when I was the commander of 9-Wing Gander, we were charged with search and rescue in the north, and it's a long ways away. And you're leapfrogging to get there, and you didn't always get there in time. So that becomes a threat in itself, I think, just the amount of people that are going to be there and the activities that are happening, and who's going to be held responsible to respond.
And from a Norwegian perspective, is this just all economic activity resulting from melting waters, and we should all just be relaxed about it, or is there something specific that you find threatening in these activities?
Well, I would distinguish between the Arctic as two different things. That the Arctic, as the Arctic, is fundamentally about managing economic interest and sea routes and so on, and we should definitely be present and follow also for that reason. But that's the not so alarming thing, but it needs more investment and more presence, because right now Russia is much more present than anybody else. And I would like to have that more balanced. Then on the other hand, of course, because great power competition is back, it also means that the Arctic is a testing ground and principally, in worst comes to show, a firing range for long-distance missiles and so on. That's very worrying, and we can see that at our doorstep, a lot of testing of very advanced new technology, but it's not directed at the Arctic as such. It just happens there. So it's important to distinguish these two things when we talk about the Arctic affairs. But both of them leads to us having to be aware and alert and present and having ability to find out. So my position is that where we can cooperate, we should cooperate. You mentioned China. In 2013, we had a vivid discussion at the Arctic Council. I was Foreign Minister then. Secretary Kerry and I and most of us agreed that we should allow for China, together with India, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, to become observers. At the time, the Harper government was skeptical, and so was Russia. It was an interesting Russia-Canadian alliance against this, but finally we, through good conversation, in an Arctic hut up in northern Sweden, we finally agreed that we should allow. And I think that was a good idea, because basically the argument was that it's better to have these people join our club than to allow them to form another club to our detriment. So by signing these documents and joining the organization as observer, not a member, you also have to sign up to certain rules of the game, and that's something we can remind them of.
And how have you found the Chinese as actors within the Arctic Council in their observer status?
They have taken a keen interest. They have used it to the maximum of the capacity, but they have done it inside the rules of the game.
I think one thing to remember also is everyone thinks that the resource component up there is extraction, such as oil or minerals. We have our protein fields of fish moving farther north all the time. So that is a major resource up there also.
And Mr. Eide, you mentioned the idea that NATO should be engaged in the Arctic. It's a question for the whole panel. Does that make sense? The Arctic Council is not about security, as I understand it. It's about managing research and search and rescue. What is Canada's perspective on elevating this to NATO?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of Canada, so I will give you my opinion on what I think it is. But I think it depends on how the threats evolve. So if the threats evolve in a certain way, then it automatically will become a NATO discussion and back on that table, much like it was many years ago. The solution sets that we may need to deter a threat if it continues to evolve. and grow, may put it back to NATO. I think the Arctic Council is a great table because it allows peace and cooperation to happen and strategic dialogue to happen separate from what might need to happen from a military perspective in that forum. And it's better to have multiple tools in the toolbox to maintain a situation than just have everything, tied together. So I like having separate solution sets that can come together at one point, but it enables different conversations to happen.
General Shaughnessy.
And we are having this in the NATO conversation. I would just highlight just a couple weeks ago, I was in Norfolk at our NATO Allied Transformation Command doing a symposium there where we were talking about the broader global defenses, of which we included the Arctic in that discussion, and how does NATO fit into that from a command and control standpoint, as well as from a threat standpoint. So I think that dialogue is happening within NATO, and will continue to happen as we look forward to really driving forward of what does all these changes in the Arctic really mean.
It's interesting, just to put this into context when we talk about NATO participation up there. When I came back from Reykjavik, I sat down with then CNO John Richardson and was expounding my newfound knowledge about the Arctic, and we have to get up there and the Navy has to get up there, and I was banging the table and he kept looking at me frowning more each time I banged the table, and he said, "Sir, we have been up there since 1968, and I went under the water doesn't count." But that being said, there is more to the Arctic than just on the surface. There is the whole air capacity up there too.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about capabilities. I find that, at least in Canada, the discussion about the Arctic often comes down to a discussion about icebreakers. How many, I read it's 13 icebreakers that Russia has. How many does the US have? How many does Canada have? Give us the lay of the land. Anyone?
Well, we have 1.5. But we've now just laid the hull on our first new series coming out. I say we. Is the Commandant here? Oh, there he is, exactly. It's the Coast Guard's mission. A lot of people turn around to the Navy and go, how come you don't have icebreakers? And I get to point to my fellow brethren here because there's no light between us, but you have the icebreaking mission. First one's being laid and 5 more to come after that. I thought I had 6.
So we're talking about a strategy to get to 6. We awarded the contract in April for the first and hopefully 3 large Polish security and then figure out the way forward after that.
It's got a real-time briefing here. This is great. Talk a little bit more about capabilities. What capabilities do you have? What do you think you need and should have?
Right, so clearly the icebreaker and our teamwork with the Coast Guard, my good friend Carl, we continue to work that and we advocate for that certainly as well. But additionally, from a capability standpoint, I think we just start with awareness. So, we have to be aware of what is happening in that environment.
So is that satellites? What does that mean?
I think it's everything, and that's traditionally, and you look back to some great binational work that was done between Canada and the U.S. with the DEW line, the distant early warning line that was created when a contract in January of 1955, completed nominally in 57, and actually it ultimately grew to be a line all the way from Midway Island to Scotland of this early warning capability. Back in the mid-'80s, 85 or so, again, a binational work after the Shamrock Summit, where we were able to have a renewed investment into that early warning between Canada and the U.S. of having that domain awareness, understanding what's happening within our own territories, was reinvigorated with the North Warning System. And so I think these kinds of things of having that awareness is something we have to look to invest in, again, as the future between the U.S. and Canada together binational. I think we can get after that. And then I think it's important to note, we send people, all our militaries do, all over the world, and very quickly can deploy somewhere and be very effective. That's different in the Arctic. It's very difficult. You can't just take people and aircraft and ships and ground troops and all the equipment that goes with that and deploy it to the Arctic and expect to be successful if you haven't trained there, if you don't have the right kit, the right gear, because it's such a harsh environment. And so we're really looking at the infrastructure to be able to deploy them, but also the training that would go with that and the right kit and gear that would go with that. And so a revamping, a reinvigorating of the exercise programs, and as the Secretary mentioned, just going there, right? We learn tons just by going there. And we've done this before, so we know how to do this. We just have to get the reps under our belt in order to do that. And then, as Tammy mentioned, simple things become hard. Communication, navigation, very difficult in the Arctic. And so I think we have to look to invest in our ability to do those things where satellite communication of above about 65 degrees starts to drop off. You get above 70, it gets even worse. And then eventually you get very little capability there. We need to invest in the ability to have that communication regardless of where you are in the Arctic. And I think that leads to some of the great innovation that might come down shortly from the commercial world that I think we can take advantage of.
Excuse me. I wanted to add. Sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, I agree, and the communication is one key word. And as you said, the geostationary satellite doesn't reach, so you need to do something about that. There are other, modern satellites, other things you can do. But I mean, those kind of things is part of the answer, not only the ships. And we don't really invest in icebreakers. We have ice-enhanced vessels, Coast Guard and so on, because our Arctic is actually largely ice-free. And it's important to understand that, for large parts of the year, what used to be frozen is now open. That's why we're having that discussion, because this is now becoming the shortest route. You can save, if you go from Yokohama to Rotterdam there, in the north, you will save like 40% of the sailing route. Now, you can't do that all the year. You don't know exactly when you arrive, which means container traffic is not so interested because they have a just-in-time principle. But bulk traffic, for instance, will increasingly go that route, and somebody has to look after that, and somebody has to be aware of that. So the commercial part of it is also relevant.
From the Canadian perspective, what kind of capabilities do you...
Well, as the minister mentioned yesterday, our Arctic offshore patrol ships are coming online, hopefully. First one last I heard was 2020. The 16 search and rescue aircraft, are set to be delivered. C-295, which will give us strategic reach. It allows us to operate in lower visibility, so that's good. They're working on the fighter project. I was talking to the commander of the Army, I'm not sure where he is, and we were kind of joking. My husband is a Patricia, like the commander of the Army, and they spent most of the first half of their career in the Arctic Circle, jumping out of planes. And the ability just to, as Commander said, just to move across, which we used to do in a BB-206, which are all now rusted out, you have to get new equipment to just drive across the Arctic. So those projects are underway. So it's having the right gear, the right training, and just being able, as the Commander said, to get there, and then once you're there, to move with some amount of access.
I'm curious about the division of labor between Canada and the United States in the Arctic. Can you sort of talk about what you expect from the Canadian military in terms of cooperation or what role it plays, and vice versa?
Right, and I think we have great cooperation every day, and I think it's important to note that literally every day as we sit here now too, we have airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines from the United States and Canada that are protecting our sovereign territory, which includes Canada and the U.S. to include the Arctic aspects of that. And they are ready, on alert right now, able to do that. What we have to do, though, is be able to stay ahead of the threat, right? And so that's going to take some investment in order to do that. And I think the investment that we do, we have an opportunity to do this binationally together, like we have in the past with as I mentioned, the DEW line was a great example, the North Warning System, where we might have a follow-on to that we could do together. I think there might be unilateral things that we could both do that would be complementary to each other there. And then as we go forward, even outside of the NORAD structure, which is binational, but really in the aerospace domain, is we have, against all the other domains, we have the bilateral relationship together. And so I think to me, it's about how do we do this together? We want to be interoperable. We want to make sure that everything we're doing is helping the overall protection of both of our nations. And I think we are looking at an opportunity now going forward to really reinvigorate and renew our efforts with respect to NORAD in particular, to modernize NORAD, to invest in NORAD's capability going into the future.
If I was to look on the Navy side, this is a perfect example where Canada and the U.S. will be no light between us. I was just talking to the Minister of Defense earlier today, and we specifically addressed this because here is a prime example of what I was talking about during my presentation. Expertise. I mean, Canada's been operating in this environment for quite some time. We have not. So we are going to be welded together. I think you'll see whenever we do a movement up here, Canada's going to be right by our side and vice versa.
And are you expecting a lot more movements up here?
As it presents itself, the opportunity presents itself, yes.
So part of what President Trump has been saying to allies And I have to say, I heard President Obama say the same thing, which is we want you to spend more. We want you to build up more in terms of defense resources. Where do you think Canada should be ramping up more in terms of the Arctic?
Canada's doing an absolutely fantastic job. We were just down at the Irving shipyard, and for those of you who drove over the bridge yesterday or the day before, there was hull number 1 in the basin of the Arctic Offshore Patrol Vessel, which is absolutely fantastic. And I gather there's 6 of those coming. I can't remember the numbers, but Canada's, as far as the surface Navy is concerned, we think they're all in.
Can I take us a little bit back to the Arctic Council and political cooperation? Because until recently, we were able to use, at least for the Council as a forum and the topics that were on the Council agenda, to keep sort of geopolitical strife out of it. And that was a deliberate strategy from all of us, not because we didn't see things happening, but that arena should be one to see cooperation. And I have to use this opportunity to say that we were a little worried, to put it carefully, about Secretary Pompeo's speech in Rovaniemi, which was the latest ministerial meeting, where he actually made a big point out of warning against Russia and China now really coming in big time and making a connection between the Arctic and the South China Sea. Well, I think that connection is wrong for the reasons I said initially. This is not an area where I mean, of course, everywhere can turn into a conflict, but there is not an ongoing dispute about anything meaningful. I mean, Canada and Denmark is quarreling about the island of Hans, but I mean, that's not going to start a war. And the US and Canada are discussing the waterways, but they're not going to go to war either. So it's not really an area of serious dispute, and let's keep it that way. So there's something called, speak softly and carry a big stick, and I think that applies well to the Arctic Council.
Just, Secretary, do you have any gloss to put on the
that sums it up perfectly.
Well, here's my question.
Pompeo?
Speaking of surprise comments, is the U.S. buying Greenland? Is it for sale? Let's talk about Greenland.
Interestingly enough, I was just over visiting our Norwegian friends for a couple of days, and on the way back, we specifically were going to stop in Greenland. And we had the whole trip lined up with our Danish friends, and we're going to go and see Nuuk, the port down there. And the Arctic did what the Arctic does, and we got weathered out. Is it a place where we can train? Most definitely. Is it a place we'd like to train? Most definitely. And we're going to explore to see if those opportunities exist.
But Senator Tom Cotton wrote a piece arguing, actually, this is a great idea. Let's buy Greenland. Is this seriously being considered? Is this?
It's above my pay grade.
Way beyond.
Well, I would talk to it from the aspect of its strategic real estate that is very helpful already for us. We have, for example, assets in Thule that are fundamental to our ability to defend North America. We have, for example, some of our radar sites, et cetera, operating out of there. And when you really look at it from that aspect with a great partner of Denmark and Greenland, it is really key to, as we go forward, looking at the future of the Arctic, that is absolutely key to that going forward.
How are those comments received in your?
Yeah, so since Denmark isn't here, I'll take some Nordic solidarity here, and not speaking for them, but I can share that there was some surprise in Copenhagen about the idea of buying it. First, because Denmark and Greenland is not for sale.
Build this nice
but secondly, why would you? Because they're already allies. I mean, working with allies is also a good idea, and I think that. Given that our dear Danish friends have been among the most active in NATO's operations abroad, I think to cancel the visit because they didn't want to sell Greenland was maybe not the best choice that the president has made so far.
Well, I read that China was actually trying to build, I think it was airports or some other kind of installations in Greenland, and that the U.S. was very much lobbying the government against that. So is this going to be an ongoing?
We're following that closely as well.
Yeah. Very interesting. So I wanted to just pull back a little bit and ask, where do you see now, we talked about the South China Sea, there are obviously a lot of things going on in the world. Where is the Arctic as a priority for each of your respective countries in terms of military and strategic priorities? Is it moving up the ranks? How does it rank?
I'll just start with Navy, but I think the general has it as a theater, so he has a different prioritization, but it's moving up in the Navy. Our job is to keep the maritime commons open, international rule and law of the sea. You know what we do as FONOPS, freedom of navigation operations. If in fact that environment opens itself up to surface travel on a regular basis, the Navy has to be there.
And just since we're in Canada, on your point about international navigation, there has been this long-standing difference of opinion about the Northwest Passage being as straits for international navigation in the U.S. point of view and territorial waters in the Canadian point of view. Is that just an agreement to disagree and that nothing's going to happen with that, or
well, like
what's
I said,
the state of play?
We're welded to our Canadian allies and would be together as we transit.
Any Canadian response to that?
Yep.
Well, in practical terms, I would say we have since 1988 an agreement that's been in place that's allowed us to have differences of opinion and still operate as great allies and partners that we are. So I think it's actually a good testimony to the strength of the relationship between the U.S. and Canada that we're able to work our way through this.
Okay, and I'm about to go to audience questions, so please raise, and we have a lot of audience questions, but just last question from someone here in the room. So this being the Halifax Security Forum, I was sitting on the hotel bus, and the person who sat next to me turned out to be an Arctic expert. So Heather Conley at CSIS, and she raised the concern that the Arctic, as you know, is spread across the various portions of the military, and you are sort of the central voice for it. But she was saying it's not the day-to-day priority for anyone, and she raised the notion that perhaps the org chart is a vulnerability, as she put it. And I wanted just to get your thoughts on that.
I would say it is in my day-to-day agenda. So that is a priority for us, both on the NORAD command and the NORTHCOM command. So it is a priority, and our unified command plan, which on the U.S. side delineates our actual responsibilities, it does designate us as the Arctic advocate. And so because of that, it is on our day-to-day look at what we're prioritizing and how we're doing that. That said, I acknowledge the fact that there are multiple seams with other COCOMs that we continue to work our way through. Like no matter where you draw a line, there's going to be a seam. And so we make sure that we have the ability to not have that be a limiting factor for us. So I work closely with both Phil Davidson on the PACOM side, with Todd Walters on the UCOM side, to make sure that seam doesn't result in any negative aspect.
I mean, this last summer, we, in General O'Shaughnessy's theater, we had an amphibious operation on the island of Adak, Alaska. That involved Indo-PACOM, Admiral Davidson. That involved General O'Shaughnessy. While the org chart might have been confusing on paper, the operation really was seamless.
I think we had a question over here. The beautiful lady in the front.
You look beautiful too, Louisa.
No.
Scotty Greenwood, Washington, D.C., Canadian American Business Council. Given the strategic importance of the Arctic, and I have a question for all y'all, as we say. There's a place in Canada that is subarctic. It's centrally located. It's on the Hudson Bay, so the Hudson Bay of the Arctic Ocean. And there are old Cold War era military facilities there. It's Churchill, Manitoba, and it's on the. So given that it's difficult to get to the Arctic, given as you all have said the challenges with infrastructure, would it make sense to look at a place like Churchill, which has an airport, and the government of Canada just last year rebuilt a railroad, and it also has a port, not to mention the community that's there and barracks that have been empty since the 1950s. Like, would Churchill, Manitoba, for example, central in the country and in the continent, be considered a strategic location? And would there ever be thought to reinvigorating that place for our strategic capability, given that there is already so much infrastructure there? That's the question. The other little observation is, so we've had a couple of business delegations to Churchill. That's how come I know about it. And for the Commandant of the Coast Guard, we were out looking at beluga whales, and there were some polar bears swimming around last summer, and we had these life suits on the boat. and we had to rescue a boat that had run out of gas, and the beluga whale operator said, "I'm also the Coast Guard." And we said, "Well, what happened? How long do these like if this tips over, there's polar bears in the water, how long do the life suits last?" And he said, "About 5 minutes." And we said, and if you're the Coast Guard, who backs you up if we need help?" And he said, "My 16-year-old daughter." So I think we might need more capability up there.
All right. That's an interesting question. Does this open up opportunities for some of these northern Canadian communities to serve a bigger strategic role?
I think for Churchill, you'd be displacing the polar bear operations of the world up there.
won't speak specifically to Churchill, but I will say that is something that we are looking at. In fact, we have a north-facing study that we're looking at the infrastructure we have both with the U.S. and Canada, and even outside of that, kind of to the point about going across the COCOM seams, for example, into Greenland, et cetera, and looking at, are we properly postured? Do we have the right infrastructure? Will we be able to increase our activity there? So these are the types of things that we're looking for, and clearly the logistics aspect of that plays a critical role.
I know that Senator Sullivan and Murkowski are really making us focus, rightly so, on do we need a strategic Arctic port, and we've been looking around up there. And Canada is now in the process of lighting up a strategic port.
And one question that came up on Twitter earlier today I wanted to pose to you is what is the role of the Indigenous people in Canada as this becomes a bigger and bigger priority?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, they already play certainly a strong role in search and rescue and just advising if they see something on what goes on. They provide the first line of defense, I would say, because they're on the ground. And I would defer that to General Vance, who's sitting in the front, if he has, since I've left, done more with Indigenous people or people in the north.
Would you like to comment? Can we get a microphone down here, please?
Yeah, thanks, Tammy.
No problem, sir. It's great to retire. You can pass the question.
Delegate up. Yeah, that's right. The northern basing infrastructure and the architecture of the defense of the approaches to Canada is going to have us look again at where we need to be with what. And the great advantage of the northern peoples, the Indigenous community, is not only are they part of the social fabric of the nation, they're also a potential workforce and on the ground and everywhere we need them. So it's not always a question of the South reinforcing the North, it's enabling the North to be a part of that fabric, whether it be a defense or any other part. So vital. And there are Canadians that need to be protected and defended, and we'll demand that too. So all the services. So they're a vital part of the whole thing.
And if I might add to that as well, you might be surprised actually how much we work with what we consider partners in the Indigenous people, and I look at it from both lenses. One, on the Northcom side and the NORAD side in Alaska, we work very closely with the Alaska Federation of Natives, in fact Julie Kika, the president, and I often work at different symposiums together. And one of the things that we find is we actually have common challenges. And so now we're looking for what are the common solutions to our common challenges. An example of that is communication. If we could break through and innovate in our ability to communicate, that would be incredibly important for some of those remote villages, as an example. We had just 2 weeks ago, we had a symposium at Fairbanks, Alaska, where we had not only the Alaska Federation of Natives there, but we also had the Canadian Rangers and that program that we have here in Canada. That is a great model that we're trying to see what can we do with that in Alaska, as an example, where we can take full advantage of the 10,000 years of experience they have within working within the Arctic that we can then bring to bear on what we need. So I think a great partnership already exists, but I think even more can be done with us and both in the U.S. and Canada.
I just also want to say that Indigenous people, in our case, the Sami community, is an important part of our Arctic policies in Norway, but also in the northern Russia, northwestern Russia, we have the Sami people living there, and the Arctic cooperation and what we call the Barents cooperation has actually also helped empowering them in Russia, because this has become a theme in Arctic conversation. So they've kind of also got an arena, international arena, that they didn't have before. Which I think is also an important dimension of the more sort of softer type of cooperation across the border.
And how do you give them a voice in your northern policy in Norway?
Yeah, well, indeed, they have definitely
Through formal.
They would probably like to have even more, but they are formally involved by all means.
A question right here in the front row, please.
Paula Dobriansky, Harvard University, but relevant to this conversation, I was an Undersecretary of State and had the responsibility in my portfolio of attending Arctic Council meetings, and I attended 3 of them. But the one that I remember especially, and just a brief comment, is the one that was chaired by Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, and it occurred in Siberia in Salakard. And the comment is, because you asked about threats, I have to say Russia attaches a great priority to the Arctic, and it's even stated very directly by the Russian Foreign Minister in his writings and his statements. And so with the building of the base in Trefoil and the investments that both of you have mentioned, it's very significant, and that Norway has particularly flagged. But my first question is, you mentioned Stoltenberg. Stoltenberg was here 2 years ago, and he used the platform, in fact, of Halifax to highlight a number of issues and a number of threats, and he highlighted and previewed the new command, the Atlantic Command, which was then endorsed by NATO and put into Norfolk. So the first question is, what beyond that? There's been some conversation within NATO of going beyond the Atlantic Command and really devoting singularly a command structure in NATO to the Arctic. I'd want your reaction on that. And then the second one is, from having had also the benefit of going several times to the Arctic, to Svalbard, the northernmost human settlement of Norway, India, China, and Russia all have research facilities. The United States, we decided not to do that. Is that something that's part of the calculation in this regard, given the comments about what assets we put in and what our investments are?
Go ahead.
I'll start it out just with Second Fleet, which is our asset contribution foundation for the NATO structure, a joint structure, which, as you know, when the wall fell and history stopped, we hung up the Second Fleet. Well, it's back in full operation now. And that's the U.S.'s contribution to that. But as far as NATO actually making a full Arctic command, I am not aware of it, only because I'm not involved in that right now. Research is a great question. And if you look at ONR, the Office of Naval Research, we're actually discussing that right now as to what is up there. But you can't go up there just for the sake of saying research. As you know, you have to have a plan for what you want to research. Priming the pump.
Interesting. Go ahead.
So back in the Cold War, NATO had regional command centers with regional responsibilities, and they knew what was where. Then after the Cold War, we had a long period where, believe it or not, it's almost incredible to think about it, but we didn't have that, because any NATO command was either doing transformation or it was doing some kind of desert operation in a faraway place. So we didn't have these geographical responsibilities. That has been brought back. Partly thanks to the initiative that we were part of as Norway. I'm very happy for that. I'm glad for what happened with Norfolk. And of course, we also have the national commands, which are part of NATO as well. So our northern core command center in Reitan outside of Bodø is also there for NATO. So it's not only about what you call the combined centers, but also the national presence that we all have.
Gentleman in the second row.
General O'Shaughnessy, Dov Zakheim, used to be Undersecretary of Defense. But General O'Shaughnessy, you mentioned the Shamrock deal. I negotiated that. We had it done by noon because the President and Mulrooney had to sign it a couple of hours later. So my question to you, actually, is where does the upgrade of the North Warning System now stand? And having been in charge of the money in the Pentagon, do you have the money for it?
Right. Well, one, thank you for negotiating that between President Reagan and Prime Minister Mulroney. That system has really been critical to us going forward. And in fact, we are looking at what is the next step for that, and what is the modernization of that. We have an analysis alternative that's actually a binational study being done right now that is determining what is the best way forward. My sense is that there will be not only a reinvestment in the North Warning System type approach, but also bigger than that, right? Because we have to go beyond just having terrestrial-based radars for our awareness, and really the proliferation of LEO, the other added capability and technology that we now have is what we're looking for from analysis of alternatives. So yes, it is being looked at. The study is funded, and we're looking at what is the output of that study shortly to see what is the way ahead that then will work binationally in the broader structure.
The gentleman right there by the camera in the second row.
Yeah, Tadek Kamiya, Professor of International Relations at National Defense Academy of Japan. Two military leaders of the United States have emphasized that the importance of extending existing liberal international, rules-based international order to the Arctic region. And they emphasize that, importance of the alliance cooperation to achieve that goal. But mainly, the discussion has been focused on the Atlantic region. How about in Asia? Japan is the major U.S. ally in Asia, but it's non-Arctic country. What kind of role does the United States expect or wants to see from Japan? I would like to answer this question from Mr. Secretary.
Yes, definitely. No. So this summer when we had our Arctic exercise up there, that was the first time we've gone up in quite some time. Next time we go up with our allies. Japan will be invited to come right along with us. A participant as a surface combatant, where we could actually train together, integrate together, and war game together.
Can you take us to that exercise? I'd love to hear more about it. What did you learn? I heard you got, like, the seas were a little rough.
Well, that was over in Trident Juncture, yeah, which I talked about there. The seas were a little rough, but I'll tell you about what happened on the Pacific side. Was the Arctic does what it does so well. We learned a lot. We had helicopters on the back of one of our ships, and we found out that we had to slow down considerably because the helicopter there was no hangar space for the helicopter. So we had to travel at the max limits of what the wind speeds were for the helicopter. We learned from that. Weather came in, and it was aborted for 3 days. I mean, we really learned that, like Mike Tyson says, a plan's really great till you get punched in the face. We got punched in the face a couple of times, but that's what the Arctic is about. It's about a very austere and unforgiving climate.
A question right here, Senator.
If I could ask, I think you said you thought these issues were important but not alarming, and then the moderator said, Mr. Secretary, alarm us. And you went down the line, and I noticed that none of you in your alarm said the actual melting of ice and the rising of the sea level and the melting of the permafrost. None of you said that was your principal alarm. You focused on what countries are doing. Have you all just sort of planned that that's just kind of baked in and there's nothing we can do about it? And is that why it didn't jump to mind as an alarm? What is the consensus planning about, 10, 20, 50 years, and then the challenges that presents?
Go ahead.
Can I? Very good question, and thanks for asking. I was hoping to get there. The melting of the ice and the climate change is a very deep global concern. It's actually my #1 concern these days, and it's going to grow in our collective concern. And we can see that in the Arctic, because over 2 degrees warming of the globe means maybe 8 to 10 degrees warming of the high north and the deep south, because of the nature of these things. So we can see that very close hands. And one particular effect, and you mentioned the permafrost. People talk about the melting of the ice, but the breaking up of the permafrost is very relevant for northern Russia, because they're already seeing that infrastructure that is built on what was believed to be fixed land is now literally breaking. Entire small towns are breaking apart, roads are breaking apart, which forces more of the domestic traffic to go out to the sea, the Arctic Sea, simply because there you can sail because the ice is gone. So it's a major change for Russia. It will probably come to Canada and all of us eventually, but this is already very noticeable, and we have to understand that this is part of Russia's concern as well, on the massive changes going on geophysical in their neighborhood because of climate change. So it's a big deal. And there's also the ice is melting, but also moving. So there are parts of the Arctic where there will be more ice, even if the total amount goes down. So it's sort of because of current and several things which I can't explain, but other people can. But you have a significant also movement of ice. And as the Secretary mentioned, fish will move. Fish prefers colder water, I mean cod and so on. So they will move away from where they used to be, you know, to the detriment of the fishermen who's there, and then they will appear elsewhere. And that can also create new questions and new tensions, of course.
I know in the Canadian North, there's already a lot of climate change impacts. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, there is. I mean, I was going to ask you if my 3 daughters had called to tell you to yell at me about the environment in the Arctic, because we have this conversation at my house quite often. You know, we note that permafrost is melting, the ice is melting, the air is getting warmer, precipitation patterns are changing, harmful UVB radiation is increasing exponentially. When the permafrost, you know, thaws, gases come out, that causes more methane, more issues in the thing. NASA has said that, you know, we've lost, the polar ice caps are melting actually at 9% every decade. So if you look at it that way, we've lost 40% of the Arctic ice is thickness since 1960, and 95% of the oldest documented ice is gone. 99% of our fresh water supply is in the Arctic and the Antarctica. You know, when I look at the climate change piece, sir, I kind of look at it, it's a whole of government, you know, to try to figure out how we're going to stop that. And more than that, it's every nation in this room to figure out what are we going to do to stop what's happening in the Arctic. It's just not a simple, when we talk about it being complex, you know, it affects the rest of the world. And it's a huge Herculean effort, I think, to stop what we've put in place, what's happening now.
Just a very quick comment on it, just to be clear. The ice that is already in water, when it melts, it doesn't raise the water level because it is water. So the ice you should be worried about for sea rise is the Greenland ice and the Antarctic ice and the Himalaya ice, and it will happen, so we have a problem. But it's not the floating ice, because that just converts to another form of water. It's still a problem, but it's a different problem.
So we talk a whole of globe, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up, but we talk about China, to be very frank with you, which benefits from its stature as a major country without the responsibility. If you picked up this Friday's Financial Times, you saw that China is going to light up as many coal generation facilities that will negate all the positive carbon remediation that we've done on the globe. That is not a responsible member of the community. And they signed the Paris Accord. Go square that with me. The video doesn't match the audio.
Well, I think it's also interesting that they are moving so rapidly and much more rapidly than everyone else towards electrification. And just having talked to the head of the NRDC in China, saying in the last 5 years, the steps they've taken, few people are aware of, but on reducing the reliance on coal is ahead of where they thought they'd be. So I think it's a complicated question, but
saying one thing, doing another.
No, actually, I mean, there's a lot to be said about China, and we were saying it here. But on this front, I actually happened to come from China yesterday discussing exactly these things. There is a massive focus now on electrification of everything. And there's more, and this is real facts, there's more newly installed electrical power from clean energy in China alone than the rest of the world combined over the last couple of years. And there's a massive plan for a green change in China. The problem is that China's growth has been so fast. So they're both the worst in class and best in class at the same time. Emissions go up because they continue to grow, but there is also a strategy to do something about it. So I am less worried about this particular facet of China after spending a week there talking about these issues. I saw the article, but it doesn't really fit with my impression. And I also say that for the first time in many years, I saw a blue sky over Beijing. It used to be gray. Something's happening.
Question right there.
Thanks so much. Liz Economy from the Council on Foreign Relations. So actually on this point,
I loved your book.
Oh, thank you. I would say that, that CO2 emissions in China have increased each of the past 3 years, actually. And it's not just about what China's doing inside the country, but they are exporting over 100 coal-fired power plants through their Belt and Road projects. So I tend to align myself with you know, Mr. Oh, I just forgot your name. So anyhow, here's my
Secretary Spencer, who's not resigning.
Thank you. Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. My comment on the Arctic is I understand the rationale for bringing China into granting it observer status, but I think that's not where China is going to stop. And if you think about this in the context of Xi Jinping's call for China to lead in the reform of global governance. I think you can look at its comments about climate change, for example, and that what's taking place in the Arctic with regard to climate change means that it cannot be managed by the Arctic Council members themselves, right? So with resources and climate change, they're going to need to broaden the group that is addressing Arctic-related issues. So I think this is a first step, just as a call-out, a first step toward China trying to increase its role in the sort of decision-making elements of the Arctic. But my question is, somebody raised the point about the polar belt and road, and what we've seen is that there's been a move from the economic elements of the Belt and Road to security elements, right? With the ports, with airports, et cetera. I'm wondering whether you see the potential for that happening in the Arctic, that as China's economic role grows, which it is, that it will begin to say things like, we need to have our military present in order to protect our resources and our people.
Great question. Does one follow the other?
Yeah, well, I'll take a shot at that. I'll start out with the Shui Long is a Chinese research vessel that has been repeatedly going into the Arctic, and we see that as the probable precursor to additional Chinese military operations within that. So yes, we do see potential for Chinese military activity there, and obviously we are concerned with that and would want to be able to respond.
And I think the whole dynamic does change as the ice departs, because then if it becomes a maritime commons, the Arctic Council takes a whole different taxonomy.
And do you think, Mr. Reid, because you were talking about the Arctic Council, is China satisfied now with its observer status, or do you expect to see them want to get an actual seat at the table, or other countries who might want to join?
Well, I mean, those who form the council will decide, and I don't think we're going to offer seats to any country that isn't an Arctic country. I mean, that's part of the logic of that council. But I agree. I mean, China will take a broader interest by all means. That's absolutely clear. But there's a difference, again, between the Arctic and other areas where China engages. I mean, there's a limited number of countries in the Arctic. Russia. I don't think they will sell ports to China, but if they do, we can't do much about it, but I doubt it. I don't think Canada and the US will. We will definitely not. And there has been, as we know, there's been questions about it in Greenland and Iceland, at least previously, that we're watching. But it's not like, there's not like a bunch of weak, failing states with high depth up there. That's not, so let's remember it's a different area. You simply can't do what China is doing in many other parts because those countries don't exist. I mean, if we agree that Russia is at least a well-organized state, even if it's not organized as we would want it, I mean, it means it's all the Arctic states are reasonably centrally controlled, organized states that can make decisions. That's a big difference, and I think it matters in this context when we make that comparison with being the Belt and Road, because that's, to put it carefully, not the case for the whole of the Stans and the South Asia and so on.
Well, thank you all. I'm sorry we've run out of time, but this has been wonderful, and I think we've learned a lot, and we've learned that we're not quite alarmed yet, but this is an issue that's rising, I think, up the priority list. Obviously, we can expect a lot more investment in capabilities, in research, and a lot more discussion on these topics, and a lot more rethinking of what is the role here for cooperation versus a competition.
Deal with it early, and we avoid the alarm, right?
Excellent.
That's right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.